What if I told you that everything you've been hearing about China's economy is carefully curated? That the narrative of inevitable collapse, of a dragon falling from the sky, is perhaps one of the most convenient stories ever told? Today, we're going to talk about The Economist, the data, and the perspectives that somehow never make it to your evening news. Let's start with something simple. When was the last time you heard good news about China? I'm serious. Think about it. Open any major Western publication and you'll find articles about demographic decline, real estate crashes, youth unemployment, capital flight, and authoritarian overreach. The message is clear and consistent. China's rise was temporary, and the fall is imminent. But here's what's fascinating. This narrative has been on repeat for over 2 decades, yet China's economy is now larger than the entire European Union combined. I'm not here to tell you China is perfect, far from it, but I am here to show you that the economic story you're being fed is incomplete at best and deliberately misleading at worst, because there are economists, brilliant ones, whose research and perspectives are systematically ignored or dismissed. And when you actually look at what they're saying, the picture becomes far more complex and honestly, far more interesting. Let's talk about Arthur Kroeber, founding partner of Gavekal Dragonomics and author of China's Economy, What Everyone Needs to Know. Kroeber has been studying China's economy for over 30 years, and his perspective is nuanced in a way that doesn't fit the binary narrative. He argues that China's economic model, while different from Western capitalism, has proven remarkably adaptive. The Chinese government's ability to redirect resources, restructure industries, and implement long-term planning has created what he calls directed capitalism. It's not the free market paradise that Western economics textbooks describe, but it's also not the rigid Soviet-style command economy that many assume. Here's where it gets interesting. Kroeber points out that China's government debt, which Western media loves to catastrophize, is fundamentally different from Western debt. Most of it is owed by state-owned enterprises to state-owned banks, which are ultimately controlled by the state. It's essentially the government owing money to itself. Now, can this create inefficiencies? Absolutely. Can it lead to misallocation of resources? Sure. But is it the same as Greece owing money to German banks? Not even close. Yet the Western media uses the same alarmist language for both. Then there's Michael Pettis, a finance professor at Peking University, who has been living and teaching in China for over 20 years. Pettis is particularly interesting because he's actually critical of many aspects of China's economic model, especially its reliance on investment over consumption. But here's what the mainstream narrative misses. Pettis argues that China's transition from an investment-led to a consumption-led economy is happening, just not at the pace or in the way that Western economists predicted. He points out that Chinese household consumption has been growing steadily and that the country has been making structural reforms, albeit slowly and carefully. What's crucial about Pettis's work is that he explains why China can't just flip a switch and become a consumption economy overnight. The entire economic and political system is built around the current model. Changing it requires unwinding decades of policy, restructuring the financial system, and managing enormous social implications. It's like trying to rebuild an airplane while it's flying. Western economists often criticize China for moving too slowly, but Pettis points out that moving too fast could trigger the very collapse these critics predict. Now let's talk about someone who really makes Western policymakers uncomfortable, Yanis Varoufakis. Yes, the former Greek finance minister who battled the European Union. Varoufakis has written extensively about how China represents an alternative economic model that directly challenges Western hegemony. He argues that China has created what he calls techno-feudalism with Chinese characteristics, where the state maintains ultimate control over technology platforms and capital flows, preventing the kind of unaccountable corporate power that dominates Western economies. Whether you agree with Varoufakis or not, his point is profound. China has shown that you can have rapid economic development, technological innovation, and rising living standards without following the Washington consensus. This terrifies Western economic institutions because it undermines the entire narrative that liberal democracy and free market capitalism are the only path to prosperity. If China succeeds with a different model, what does that say about the inevitability of the Western system? Let's dive into some actual numbers that rarely get discussed. China's middle class is now larger than the entire population of the United States. Let that sink in. We're talking about over 400 million people who have moved from poverty to middle-class status in a single generation. This is the largest and fastest poverty reduction in human history. The World Bank confirms this. The United Nations confirms this. Yet somehow, this barely registers in Western media coverage. Here's another number. China produces more scientific research papers than the United States. In fields like artificial intelligence, quantum computing, and renewable energy, Chinese institutions are leading in both quantity and increasingly in quality of research. China has more STEM graduates than the US and Europe combined. These aren't opinions. These are verifiable facts from international scientific databases. But when was the last time you saw a primetime news segment celebrating China's contributions to global scientific knowledge? Or consider infrastructure. China has built over 40,000 kilometers of high-speed rail in less than 15 years. The United States has 0 kilometers of true high-speed rail. China's subway systems have expanded to more cities and more kilometers than any other country in the world. Chinese cities are becoming models of urban planning and public transportation. Meanwhile, American infrastructure is literally crumbling, receiving a C- grade from the American Society of Civil Engineers. Yet the narrative remains that China builds ghost cities, while America represents advanced development. Let me introduce you to Keiyu Jin, an economist at the London School of Economics who wrote The New China Playbook. Jin argues that Western economists fundamentally misunderstand Chinese economic decision-making because they apply Western frameworks to a different system. In the West, we think about quarterly earnings, election cycles, and short-term market reactions. China's government thinks in 5-year plans, decade-long infrastructure projects, and generational timelines. This isn't better or worse, it's just different. But it means that judging China's economy by Western metrics is like judging a marathon runner by sprint times. Jin points out something crucial. China's apparent inefficiencies are sometimes deliberate choices. Maintaining employment in certain state-owned enterprises, even when they're not maximally profitable, serves social stability goals. Building infrastructure ahead of demand creates long-term competitive advantages. These strategies don't maximize short-term GDP growth, but they serve other objectives that the Chinese government prioritizes. Western economists call this inefficient. Jin asks, inefficient for what purpose? Now, let's address the elephant in the room, the real estate sector. Yes, Evergrande collapsed. Yes, there are concerns about local government debt tied to land sales. Western media has been predicting a real estate crash that would bring down China's entire economy for years. But here's what economists like Logan Wright from the Rhodium Group point out. The Chinese government has enormous tools to manage this transition. They can force banks to extend credit, restructure debt, move assets between state entities, and implement capital controls to prevent panic. Is this free market economics? No. Can it prevent a disorderly collapse? Absolutely. China has already demonstrated this capability multiple times, from managing the stock market volatility in 2015 to controlling capital outflows. The government's ability to intervene in markets, which Western economists criticize as distortionary, is precisely what gives it crisis management tools that Western governments don't have. When Lehman Brothers collapsed, the U.S. government couldn't just order other banks to absorb the losses. China can and does. Here's something that really doesn't get enough attention: China's strategic patience. While the West focuses on quarterly earnings and 2-year election cycles, China has been executing a decades-long strategy. The Belt and Road Initiative, which Western media often dismisses as debt trap diplomacy, is actually the largest infrastructure investment in human history. China is literally building the trade routes of the 21st century. Whether it succeeds or fails, the ambition and long-term thinking involved are staggering. George Magnus, economist and author of Red Flags: Why Xi's China is in Jeopardy, is actually quite critical of China's current direction under Xi Jinping, but even Magnus acknowledges that underestimating China has been a consistent mistake of Western analysts. He points out that every time Western economists predict China's imminent collapse, the country adapts and evolves. The question isn't whether China faces challenges, it absolutely does, but whether its system has the capability to address them. Let's talk about demographics, because this is the favorite doom scenario right now. China's population is aging and shrinking. This is true. But here's what economist Stuart Giedel-Baston from the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology points out. China is aware of this problem and is preparing for it in ways Western countries aren't. Massive investments in automation and artificial intelligence, development of elder care systems, and restructuring of the economy to be less labor-intensive. Will this completely solve the problem? Probably not. But it's a more proactive response than most Western countries have managed. Moreover, the demographic decline narrative ignores that China still has 700 million people in rural areas with lower productivity. There's enormous potential for continued urbanization and productivity gains. India might have a younger population, but China has infrastructure, education systems, and industrial capacity that India won't match for decades. Here's a perspective that will probably upset people. Richard Wolff, Marxist economist and professor emeritus at the University of Massachusetts. Wolff argues that China represents a different evolution of economic organization, one that prioritizes collective advancement over individual wealth accumulation. He points out that while Chinese billionaires exist, they operate under fundamentally different rules than Western billionaires. Jack Ma can criticize the government and disappear from public view for months. Elon Musk can criticize the government and buy Twitter. Whether you agree with Wolff's Marxist framework or not, his observation raises an important question. Who actually has more power, corporations or governments? In China, the answer is unambiguously the government. In the West, it's increasingly unclear. When tech companies can influence elections, shape public discourse, and operate above national regulations, are we really in a position to lecture China about accountability? Let me hit you with another uncomfortable fact. Income inequality. The Gini coefficient measures income inequality, with 0 being perfect equality and 1 being perfect inequality. China's Gini coefficient has been declining since 2008 and is now lower than the United States. Yes, you heard that right. Communist China has less income inequality than capitalist America. How is this not a bigger story? Thomas Piketty, the French economist famous for Capital in the 21st Century, has noted that China's approach to wealth inequality, including recent crackdowns on tech billionaires and education companies, represents a different model of managing capitalism's excesses. While Western countries debate whether to slightly increase taxes on the ultra-wealthy, China simply does it. They restructure entire industries overnight if they believe it serves social goals. Now let's talk about something that really bothers me. The selective use of data. When China's GDP growth slows from 10% to 5%, it's presented as economic crisis. When the US grows at 2%, it's presented as solid performance. China's 5% growth on a $14 trillion economy adds more absolute economic output than the US's 2% growth on a $25 trillion economy. But the narrative remains, China slowing, America strong. Or consider debt to GDP ratios. Japan's government debt is over 250% of GDP, and Western economists discuss it as a unique situation requiring nuanced understanding. China's total debt is around 300% of GDP, and it's presented as an imminent crisis. Why the different framing? Could it be because one narrative serves Western interests and the other doesn't? Barry Naughton, professor at the University of California, San Diego, and one of the West's foremost experts on the Chinese economy, has spent his career trying to inject nuance into these discussions. He argues that China's economic system is neither purely socialist nor purely capitalist, but a hybrid that defies easy categorization. He points out that this system has proven remarkably resilient and adaptive, constantly evolving in response to challenges. Naughton's work shows that Chinese policymakers are sophisticated economic thinkers who study global best practices and adapt them to Chinese conditions. They're not ideologues blindly following Marxist textbooks. They're pragmatists experimenting with different approaches and scaling up what works. This crossing the river by feeling the stones approach has been derided as lacking theoretical foundation, but it's also produced the most successful economic development story in modern history. Here's something that should make everyone uncomfortable. China's investments in green technology. China produces over 70% of the world's solar panels, 60% of wind turbines, and 75% of electric vehicle batteries. They're building renewable energy capacity faster than the rest of the world combined. Chinese cities have more electric buses than the rest of the world has total buses. Yet the narrative remains that China is the world's biggest polluter, ignoring that they're also the biggest investor in solutions. Jeffrey Sachs, economist and director of the Center for Sustainable Development at Columbia University, has argued that China's commitment to renewable energy and sustainable development is genuine and represents a massive economic opportunity. While the West debates climate policy, China is creating the industries of the future. In 20 years, when the world runs on renewable energy, most of that technology will likely be Chinese. Let's talk about something that really exposes the bias: COVID responses. When China locked down cities to control COVID, Western media called it authoritarian overreach. When Western countries locked down, it was responsible public health policy. When China's zero COVID policy led to low death rates, it was unsustainable. When they finally opened up, it was chaotic mismanagement. There was literally no way for China to handle COVID that would have received positive Western coverage. Now, 3 years later, we can look at the data. China's excess mortality during COVID was significantly lower than most Western countries. Their economy recovered faster. Their infrastructure projects continued. Yet the narrative remains that their response was a failure, while the Western response was, at worst, a series of understandable mistakes. I want to talk about Nicholas Lardy from the Peterson Institute for International Economics. Lardy has been studying China's economy for decades and has a fascinating perspective. He argues that China's private sector is much larger and more dynamic than official statistics suggest. Many companies classified as state-owned are effectively private in their operations. The distinction between public and private in China is blurry in ways that don't map onto Western categories. This means that assessments of China's economy, based on the assumption of a dominant state sector, are fundamentally flawed. Here's a question nobody wants to ask. What if China's model actually works better for certain goals? Not for maximizing individual liberty or freedom of speech, but for building infrastructure, reducing poverty, advancing technology, and competing geopolitically? What if there isn't one optimal economic system, but different systems optimized for different values and contexts? This question is almost taboo in Western discourse because it challenges fundamental assumptions. We've been told that liberal democracy and free market capitalism are not just preferable, but inevitable. Francis Fukuyama's end of history thesis assumed that all countries would eventually converge on the Western model. China's continued success under a different system undermines this entire worldview. Let's address innovation because the narrative is that China can copy but not create. Yet China now leads the world in patent applications, including in cutting-edge fields like AI and quantum computing. Companies like Huawei, DJI, and ByteDance aren't copying Western products. They're creating original innovations that Western companies then try to copy. TikTok's algorithm is more sophisticated than anything Silicon Valley produced. Chinese fintech, through platforms like WeChat Pay and Alipay, is years ahead of Western payment systems. Dan Wang, a technology analyst who writes extensively about Chinese innovation, argues that China has moved beyond the copycat phase and is now at the frontier of multiple technologies. The question is no longer whether China can innovate, but whether the West can keep up. This shift has massive implications for everything from military technology to consumer products to global standard setting. Here's something that keeps me up at night. What happens when the largest economy in the world, the largest trading partner for most countries, the largest creditor nation, operates under a completely different set of rules and values than the US-led international order? This isn't about whether China's system is better or worse. It's about the fact that we're entering a world where there isn't a single dominant economic model. Martin Jacques, author of When China Rules the World, argues that we're witnessing not just the rise of another Western-style power, but the emergence of a fundamentally different civilization with different values, different priorities, and different ways of organizing society and economy. The assumption that China will eventually liberalize and become more like the West has been proven wrong. Instead, China is becoming more assertively Chinese, and that has profound implications. So why don't you hear these perspectives? Why is the Western narrative so consistently negative about China's economy? I think there are several reasons. First, genuine concern about authoritarian governance and human rights issues makes people reluctant to acknowledge economic successes. Second, geopolitical competition makes it strategically useful to present China as weak or failing. Third, ideological commitment to free market capitalism makes it psychologically difficult to accept that alternative models might work. But here's the thing, reality doesn't care about our narratives. China's economy is going to continue developing whether Western media acknowledges it or not. Chinese innovations will continue whether we celebrate them or not. The question is whether we in the West are so committed to our story about China's inevitable failure that we blind ourselves to what's actually happening. I'm not saying China doesn't face enormous challenges. Demographic decline, debt levels, the middle income trap, environmental degradation, and international tensions are all real. But Western economies face their own massive challenges: political polarization, infrastructure decay, educational decline, healthcare crises, and loss of industrial capacity. The difference is that we're conditioned to see our challenges as temporary and solvable, while China's are presented as systemic and fatal. The economists I've discussed today offer more nuanced perspectives. They see both strengths and weaknesses, opportunities and threats, impressive achievements and serious problems. This complexity doesn't fit into a 5-minute news segment or a clickbait headline, so it gets ignored. Here's my challenge to you. The next time you read an article about China's economy, ask yourself what perspective is being excluded. Who benefits from this narrative? What would economists who actually study China in depth say about this? Are you getting analysis or propaganda dressed up as analysis? The truth is that China's economic story is one of the most important developments of our lifetime. How it unfolds will shape the 21st century for everyone on this planet. We deserve better than simplistic narratives designed to make us feel superior or afraid. We deserve the full, complex, uncomfortable truth. Because here's the ultimate irony. By consistently underestimating China, by dismissing their achievements and exaggerating their problems, the West might be setting itself up for the very failure it projects onto China. While we're busy writing articles about China's imminent collapse, they're building infrastructure, advancing technology, and reshaping global trade. While we debate, they act. Maybe it's time we started listening to the economists. The West doesn't want you to hear about China, not because they're always right, but because they're asking better questions. And in the end, asking the right questions matters more than comfortable answers.